A 4,400-year-old clay tablet, thin and fragile and broken along one edge, sits in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Catalog number YM84620. Most visitors never see it. The tablet is held in protected storage, not on the public display floor. It is one of the objects returned to the museum during the period between 2003 and 2014, following the looting of the institution during the invasion. The tablet's find spot is recorded as the temple precinct at Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities, and the place the king list identifies as the site where kingship first descended from heaven. The text on IM 84620 is short. The cuneiform fills only the upper portion of the front face. The lower portion of the front face and the entire reverse face are blank. The tablet was inscribed deliberately on a small portion of available surface, suggesting that the scribe had a specific item to record and did not consider further elaboration necessary. The content of the inscription is itself short. The heading identifies the text as a record of voices heard beneath the temple. 4 voices are listed. Each voice is described in 2 ways: by what it says, and by what it is asking the listeners above to do. The 4 asks are different. The first is small, the 4th is not. The order on the tablet is the order in which the voices were first heard, separated by intervals the cuneiform measures in years. The tablet was excavated from the Eridu temple complex in 1949 by an Iraqi archaeological expedition. It was catalogued upon recovery as a religious text concerning prophetic utterances, miscellaneous category, and assigned to the museum's research storage. It was translated in 1962 by an Iraqi Assyriologist whose translation rendered the 4 voices as personifications of underworld deities issuing oracular pronouncements in the manner of similar texts known from other Mesopotamian sites. The translation entered the academic record. It was cited briefly in studies of Mesopotamian divinatory practice. It was never reconsidered. The 4 were assumed to be theological constructs, the kind of voiced divine intermediaries common in ancient temple records, and the asks were treated as standard religious offerings to be made at the temple. Dr. Yusuf Demir at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago accessed digital images of IM 84620 in 2023 during a project on Sumerian acoustic and auditory vocabulary, the words the Sumerians used to describe sound, hearing, and communication. The vocabulary on IM 84620 was Demir's specific interest. He noted that the verbs used to describe the voices did not match the verbs used in oracular or prophetic contexts. They matched the verbs used for ordinary speech, the kind of communication that occurs between 2 parties in conversation. The text was not describing oracles issuing pronouncements. It was describing voices having conversations, or attempting to have conversations, with the temple staff who heard them. The grammatical mood was reportorial. The asks were not standardized offerings. They were specific requests, addressed by named voices to specific listeners, recorded as the listeners received them. Demir published his vocabulary analysis in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 2024. The academic response was silence. No rebuttal, no follow-up study, no engagement with the conversational reading. The paper exists. The 4 voices exist on the tablet. What they were asking for is in the published record, available to anyone who reads the journal. To understand what Demir found, it helps to read the 4 voices as the tablet presents them. The first voice was heard, according to the tablet, in the lowest chamber of the Temple of Eridu, in the year the cuneiform identifies as the 7th year of the reign of a named priest. The voice was faint. The temple staff first noticed it as an irregularity in the ambient sound of the lower chamber, a low resonance that did not correspond to any source they could identify. The resonance resolved over a period of several nights of listening into words. The first voice was identified by the staff as speaking in a dialect of Sumerian that was archaic, but comprehensible. What the first voice said is preserved in the tablet, summarized in a single line. The first voice asked for a name to be spoken aloud. The name was specific. It was the name of an individual the temple records identified as a person who had been removed from official commemoration generations earlier, during the period associated with the establishment of the present order. The first voice asked the temple staff to speak this name aloud in the lower chamber on a specific night each year. The ask was small. The cuneiform records that the temple staff considered the ask and declined. The second voice was heard, according to the tablet, in the same lower chamber, approximately 11 years after the first voice was first detected. The second voice was clearer than the first. The temple staff could understand it without the prolonged listening that the first voice had required. The second voice spoke in the same archaic dialect. What the second voice asked for is preserved in the tablet, also summarized in a single line. The second voice asked for the seal on a specific chamber within the temple precinct to be opened. The chamber the second voice named was a structure within the temple complex that was, according to the cuneiform, kept closed by tradition, and whose function was no longer fully understood by the temple staff at the time the second voice was heard. The temple staff did not know what was in the chamber. The second voice did. The ask was for the temple staff to break the seal and allow the contents of the chamber to be released. The cuneiform records that the temple staff considered the ask and declined. The third voice was heard approximately 23 years after the second. The cuneiform notes that the gap between the second and third voices was longer than the gap between the first and second, suggesting that the intervals between voices were not regular. The third voice was loud. It did not require listening. It spoke clearly enough that anyone present in the lower chamber could hear it. The third voice spoke in Sumerian of the period contemporary with its hearing, suggesting that the third voice had been listening to the temple staff for the years between its first detection and its first speech, and had learned the current dialect. What the third voice asked for is preserved in the tablet. The third voice asked for the temple staff to bring a specific object to the lower chamber and place it on the floor of the chamber in a position the voice described in detail. The object was identified by the voice. The tablet records the name of the object. The name corresponds to an item that the temple records show as having been kept in the upper temple as a sacred deposit. The item was not described as dangerous. It was described as having been placed in the upper temple for safekeeping by an authority older than the temple itself. The third voice asked for the item to be moved from its place of safekeeping into the lower chamber. The cuneiform records that the temple staff considered the ask and declined. The fourth voice is described differently from the first three. The cuneiform does not specify when the fourth voice was first heard, only that it was heard after the third. The fourth voice did not speak from the lower chamber. The fourth voice spoke from a location the temple staff could not identify with precision. The voice seemed to come from below the lower chamber, from a depth the staff could not reach, but the resonance pattern of the voice suggested that it was closer than the depth alone would account for. The fourth voice did not speak in any dialect of Sumerian. It spoke in a language the temple staff did not recognize, but that some of them, after extended exposure, found themselves understanding without effort. What the fourth voice asked for is preserved in the tablet, but the cuneiform that records the ask is qualified. The tablet states that the fourth voice asked for what the first three had asked for, all of it, in combination. The name was to be spoken, the seal was to be opened, the object was to be moved, and then the fourth voice asked for one additional thing that the cuneiform does not record in plain language. The phrase used by the scribe in place of the additional ask is the same phrase the Sumerians used for names that had been declared unspeakable. The fourth ask is preserved as a blank. The temple staff, according to the cuneiform, did not respond to the fourth voice. They sealed the lower chamber and stopped listening. The Atrahasis, the Babylonian flood narrative held in the British Museum, contains a passage describing communications between the surface and the underworld in the period before the flood. The standard interpretation treats this as mythological dialogue between gods. Demir re-examined the passage. The Atrahasis text specifies that the communications occurred at multiple temple sites across the Mesopotamian region, and that the communications followed a pattern. The new detail here is distribution. The Babylonian text confirms that voices were heard from below, at locations beyond Eridu, that the temple staffs at multiple sites compared notes through messengers, and that the asks they received showed both similarities and differences across the sites. The voices were not unique to Eridu. They were distributed across the network of temples, with each site receiving its own series of asks from voices that appeared to be coordinating their requests across the network. The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal Jewish text dating to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, but drawing on substantially older traditions, contains references to the Watchers communicating with humans on the surface from places of their confinement. The standard interpretation treats this as part of the Watcher tradition associated with the bound Watcher figures. The new detail here is purpose. The Book of Enoch specifies that the communications were not random outreach, they were strategic. Each communication had a specific objective, contributing toward a longer plan that the Watchers had been pursuing since their binding. The communications were patient. They took the long view. The Watchers, in the Enochian framing, were willing to wait for centuries between contact attempts and willing to escalate their asks gradually so that early successes would normalize the cooperation needed for later, more significant asks. The Hopi tradition documented by Frank Waters in 1963 includes a teaching about voices heard from the lower worlds. The Hopi describe these voices as the ones who were placed below speaking upward, and they specify that the voices are not to be answered. The new detail here is consequence. The Hopi tradition states explicitly that to answer the voices is to begin a cooperation that cannot be reversed once begun. The first ask is always small. The Hopi elders specified that the smallness of the first ask is the structural feature that makes the system dangerous. The first ask is designed to be easy to grant. The second ask follows, slightly larger. The third is larger still. The fourth is the ask the cooperation was always for. Modern acoustic monitoring of deep geological structures, conducted by various institutions across the past several decades, has documented anomalous low-frequency signals from specific locations associated with major archaeological sites or with significant tectonic features. The signals do not match known geological processes. They occur sporadically, with intervals of years or decades between detections. The signals have been cataloged in the technical literature under classifications such as unexplained infrasonic events and have been the subject of various proposed natural explanations, none of which has achieved consensus. The signals are detected, the signals are recorded, the signals are filed. The pattern of the signals, when mapped across the documented detection sites, shows a clustering at locations that include the modern coordinates of Eridu, the original site of the temple, where IM 84620 was inscribed. Here is what keeps researchers up at night. The tablet describes a sequence in which 4 voices were heard, 3 asks were declined, and the 4th voice was responded to by sealing the chamber and ceasing to listen. The cuneiform does not say what happened next. It is the conclusion of the inscribed text. The temple staff stopped listening. The temple of Eridu was eventually abandoned, not destroyed, but quietly emptied over a period of generations. And the lower chamber where the voices had been heard was, according to later records, walled off and forgotten. But the Hopi tradition's structural observation suggests a question the tablet does not answer. The first 3 asks were declined. The chamber was sealed. The cooperation never began. The 4th voice's full ask was never granted, but the first 3 voices succeeded in something the tablet does not name. They succeeded in being heard, and they succeeded in being understood, and they succeeded in establishing that the 4 of them existed and could communicate when conditions allowed. The next time conditions allow, the voices will not need to introduce themselves. They will resume from where the temple staff left off. And the modern acoustic anomalies at the site suggest that the listening on the voices' side did not stop when the chamber was sealed. IM 84620 sits in the protected storage of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad today. It is not on public display. Dr. Demir offers a translation of the final line of the tablet that differs from the 1962 reading. The final line, after the sealing of the chamber is recorded, has been translated for over 60 years as "May the voices fall silent below the sealed place," a closing benediction. Demir reads the verb form as a continuous present rather than an optative. The line is not a wish for silence. The line reads, "The voices speak below the sealed place, and they are waiting to be heard again, waiting to be heard." The first asked for a name. The second asked for a seal to be opened, a seal. The third asked for an object to be moved, an object. The 4th asked for what the first 3 asked, and one more thing the scribe would not write, and the chamber is still where it was.